has been highlighted well in the last presentation. So, as I said, many myasthenia patients, sorry, go back. Oh, go back one slide. Okay, so frequent, 86% of patients with myasthenia will present with an ocular, will have an ocular problem, usually ophthalmoplegia or ptosis. And many of those patients will go on to generalize and develop generalized myasthenia, usually within the first 2 years. So the challenges that we face when we see a myasthenia patient is that myasthenia can mimic, especially ocular, can mimic a lot of ocular motility problems. Ptosis can have a variety of causes. The intermittent nature of the symptoms and the fluctuation symptom perhaps makes the patient hesitant to present and can present late at sometimes. The other thing about the diagnosis, I think it was highlighted in the previous talk, is that the serological tests that we do are not 100% sensitive for, especially in ocular myasthenia, and that can also delay the diagnosis. So I'm just going to show you a case, just as an example. So this is a 43-year-old man who presented with the diplopia for the last few months. I mean, he didn't have any neurological signs or weakness. He did say that it tends to get worse with certain head positions and fatigue, but this is really not very specific for myasthenia. He's hypertensive. And when I examine him, he has right hypertropia. Basically, his right eye is higher than the left eye. And this hypertropia is very comitant, meaning it is similar whenever he looks in different gazes, which is very unusual for a paralytic cause of ophthalmoplegia. So when you see that kind of patient, the differential diagnosis would be things like fourth nerve palsy is probably the most common thing you think of. Also decompensated strabismus or phoria. Myasthenia can be there, but this patient did not exhibit any signs suggestive of myasthenia. Skew deviation and thyroid eye disease. So what did I do for this patient? He just did not feel right. I thought he had the fourth nerve palsy at the beginning. So we ordered the receptors and he disappeared for 3 years. And then he came back 3 years later saying that 2 weeks after I saw him, he developed generalized weakening, difficulty breathing, had to be admitted to the hospital, into the ICU. And luckily, by that time, the antibody test had came. So the diagnosis was already made. And he was found to have thymoma, and he had thymectomy in France. And then he was started on steroids and developed a complication in his eye as a result of steroid. He had central serous retinopathy. And now he's on Cellcept and low dose of oral steroids, and he's doing well. So this is the typical scenario when we have someone with ocular myasthenia, is that the disease itself, the diagnosis itself is not really straightforward. And there are a lot of mimickers to the diagnosis. So I'm just going to show you some quick videos. So whenever we assess a patient with myasthenia, we look for fatigability and variability. And variability is probably more important because when I assess the patient, when I'm trying to measure him using prisms and so forth, these things can fluctuate during the test. And this patient exhibited, and this is courtesy of Dr. Ashraf.
Follow this. Look at this.
So this patient had ptosis, ophthalmoplegia, and orbicularis weakness.
You're right.
He had a kind of left sort of pseudo-INO pattern as well. There's another patient who presented with ophthalmoplegia, ptosis, and what do you notice first when you see this patient? That he has ptosis in the right eye. And this sometimes can be overlooked because the patient has lid retraction in the other eye. And if you look at his ocular motility, it does not really fit into a specific cranial nerve pattern. And if you see that, you really need to suspect myasthenia gravis. There's another example, patient who presented, who had a meningioma, and the neurosurgeon was going to operate on her meningioma because he thought there was something wrong with her eye movement. And the patient had ptosis in the right eye, lid retraction in the left eye, and had a pattern of bilateral pseudo I&O. This is the curtain sign, enhanced ptosis. So patient has ptosis in the right, and if you lift the right eyelid, this is just a longer. If you lift the right eyelid, the left eyelid drops because of the hearing's low. So this is the curtain sign, and this patient had also orbicularis weakness, which is also another important sign of ocular myasthenia. So mimickers of ocular myasthenia: thyroid, cranial nerve palsy, decompensated strabismus, and this is something probably that is challenging for a neurologist to diagnose. You really need to help of an ophthalmologist and to refer the patient to the ophthalmologist. Things like mitochondrial myopathy and I&O, other sort of central ocular motility syndrome. Botox is another one. So if you see diplopia, which is unexplained, always ask the patient about history of Botox. And, you know, as understandably, some patients may not be willing to give that information. So ask about history of recent Botox injection. So this is an example of a patient with chronic progressive external ophthalmoplegia. And if you look at him, you cannot tell if this patient is myasthenic if you didn't know the history, that he had ptosis and he had limited eye movement. This patient had a syndromic form of CPEO, which has been diagnosed by genetics, and he had myopathy plus other systemic manifestation. So ptosis is another problem that can be misdiagnosed. So isolated ptosis, it could be isolated finding or congenital ptosis, things like Horner, CPO, also Botox, and levator dehiscence, which occurs with the involutional changes that you see with aging. The other pearl that I tell residents or students is to check the pupil, because myasthenia will spare the pupil. So if you see pupil involvement in someone who has ptosis and ophthalmoplegia, that automatically rules out myasthenia gravis. And this gentleman had ptosis, ophthalmoplegia following a viral infection. He had difficulty walking and steadiness, and his MRI of the brain was normal. And if you look here, he has ptosis. And I'm trying to test his so checking his pupil. People don't really react very well to light, as you can see here. But if you give him a near target or accommodative target, the pupil will come down more. So he has light near dissociation, right? So this patient, sorry, can you go back a couple of slides? Or one slide? More? So this patient had Miller-Fisher syndrome, which classically known to affect the pupil, and he has ophthalmoplegia and ptosis. The ICE test, so I use that in the clinic a lot. I think it's very helpful, very sensitive, very specific. For myasthenia, this is a patient with ICE test, so you apply it to the eyelid for 2 minutes, and you need to see at least 1.5 to 2 millimeter improvement in ptosis. I don't think anybody does the tensilon test anymore, so that's kind of outdated. No, as far as the acetylcholine receptor antibodies, so it's been always taught or said that ocular myasthenia will have very low seropositive acetylcholine receptor antibodies, or sometimes they're undetected. So that applies to older types of tests, which is the ELISA or the less sensitive tests. With the new test, the RAA and the cell-based assays, I think the sensitivity is much higher. So the seropositivity does increase with age, and you want to look for the binding receptors. So anti-MuSK, they don't really present with the ocular myasthenia. They're more like bulbar and neck muscle and respiratory. We don't really see it an ocular myasthenia. Nevertheless, you need to test that for that in patients who are seronegative for acetylcholine receptor antibodies. I think the double seronegative has been talked about, and the LERB4, cortactin, and the antititans, and the other antibodies. I don't know if they're available here, if you can test for them, but in a series of patients who presented with ocular form of myasthenia, these antibodies were found to be positive. So you can find those in rare forms of ocular myasthenia. Can we go back one slide? Go back, please. Yeah, so RNS is not really helpful in ocular myasthenia. So if you want to do an electrophysiological test, you probably want to do a single fiber EMG, and this is subject to availability and the operator who has to do it. I don't recall the last time I have ordered a single fiber EMG. Now, I usually make the diagnosis clinically and using the acetylcholine receptor antibody assay. So how to differentiate patients with pure ocular from generalized? So I do rely a lot on history and asking the patients about questions. I think most of the patients who present with ocular are in fact generalized, sort of subtle, subclinical, general myasthenia who have ocular symptoms, and eventually they will generalize within 1 to 2 years. This is a study that we did a few years back. We looked at about 47 patients with ocular myasthenia. So these are patients with general myasthenia with ocular onset or pure ocular myasthenia. Most of the patients were antibody positive, and generalization occurred in 51% of these patients. The time was around a year. We found that high acetylcholine receptor antibodies were correlated with age and were associated with increased risk of generalization. There's another paper that came out a few years back looking at the predictors of secondary generalization in ocular myasthenia. And out of those, same thing, antibody positivity and was found to be the most significant predictor. But again, the study was limited because of the insufficient quality and the fact that most of the studies were observational. So the impact of misdiagnosis, I think it's been highlighted in the previous talk. So pure ocular myasthenia can take probably longer than general ocular myasthenia to be diagnosed. Patient may present late because they can ignore their symptoms because they're intermittent and fluctuating. And we don't have a very super sensitive, reliable marker for diagnosis. And this will result naturally secondary unnecessary interventions, things like surgery, which would be unnecessary, immunosuppressive therapy or steroid therapy or even thymectomy. So the impact is on the patient, just like in ocular, in general myasthenia, in ocular is probably more frustrating to the patient because patient cannot drive, they cannot look at their phone, they cannot read, and they cannot tolerate screen work. And I've seen patients who have been successfely treated with immunosuppressive therapy, yet they retain the ocular symptoms. So even if you treat the generalized or systemic forms of myasthenia, many of those patients will continue to complain of diplopia or ptosis or ocular manifestations. And if you look at the study on ravulizumab, so the ocular domains had the highest proportion of patients with severe constant impairment. So most of these patients were treated successfully, but they still exhibited ocular symptom. And if you look at the numbers here, so 28%, that means that at least 70% of patients still have ocular symptoms despite successful treatment with ravulizumab. I think recently in the Uplizna study as well, it's been presented, they showed similar findings as well, so that applies to that too. And if you look at the quality of life measures, you will see that for ocular myasthenia, you'll have probably 1 or 2 items Okay, so it doesn't really reflect the significance of these symptoms, because you have one or two items out of 10, 15 here. Here you have two items, so double vision and ptosis. And this is sort of more objective, the MOG score, the MG composite score. But again, these measures, or the quality of life measure, doesn't really represent the burden or the impact of ocular symptoms on the patient. So what we need to do is come up with some kind of ocular specific scores. So another measure that was devised was sort of dividing the ocular indices out of based on the total score, and come up with some kind of an index or measure. Patients with ocular symptoms are not really represented in trials because they can be excluded because of the floor effect on the MG-ADL tends to exclude them. And we need to have some kind of objective ocular quality of life symptoms for these patients. You need to do also subgroup analysis for the patient with ocular symptoms in the generalized myasthenia studies. And most of these results are coming from post-hoc analysis, that you really need to develop or design some kind of trials looking specifically at those symptoms who have ocular form, which are not really responsive to the treatment that is given. So the takeaway message is ocular symptoms in myasthenia are highly prevalent, disabling, and underrated, sometimes even dismissed by the clinician when they are seeing the patient, because the patient seems to be doing well otherwise, except that he's complaining of diplopia or ptosis, etc. Pure ocular myasthenia and generalized myasthenia with ocular symptoms are distinct entities. And then you want to, when you see a patient with ocular myasthenia or ocular symptom myasthenia, you want to look for signs that can suggest probably subclinical generalization. Single fiber EMG is probably the most sensitive tool here if you have it. And there remains to be a therapeutic gap between generalized remission in patients who are treated with the biological treatment in order to treat the ocular symptoms of myasthenia gravis. And I think that's it.